is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the Nash Tsunami podcast. This weekend, we're offering 5 conversations from episode 20, our discussion with Donna Cryer about the challenges for patient advocates and, for that matter, all key stakeholders as the issues become more urgent, complex, and practical. Plus, from the vault, conversation 46.5 from season 3, the wrap-up conversation from last summer's NAFLD Summit coverage. This conversation starts with Jörn Schattenberg commending Donna Cryer on her, and I quote, great overview, and then summarizing her ICER comments to say that he had believed that ICER's role included providing fair access to patients and stimulating future innovation, but that Donna's comments seemed to reflect that ICER did not rise to this standard. Donna's more candid, describing the inaccurate data and, as she puts it, bad math that ICER used in coming to its conclusions. These are similar to observations that Tony Belliati and I made the previous week. She winds up describing the entire report as, and I quote, a mess that should leave their authors, and I quote again, embarrassed. From there, I shift us back to the nomenclature document to note that as an MBA and career marketer, I find that result hard to commercialize or use in educating patients, and the result of the consensus processes did not seem to reflect practicality of the outcome. Donna notes that the impetus for the nomenclature conference was valid and driven by outside players, but regrets that EASL and AASLD did not simply say, stop it, this is not a good use of resources, and the skills and practices applied to the issue are not those she and others recommended for this task. She concludes that either they had a different goal or were unable to, as she puts it, listen and get out of the way. I respond by suggesting that the nomenclature process was built as an in-group process for academic hepatologists, citing Jeff McIntyre's observation last fall that in a group where 66% was considered a consensus, 72% came from a single stakeholder group, and that the key players in this process were those with the skills most likely to drive a consensus among that 72%. I suggest that Donna's frustrations are similar to those that Louise Campbell often expresses on this podcast on behalf of nurses and allied health professionals. Louise agrees, telling a story about recently helping a family member in a hospital and him being told, you're so fortunate to have a family member to advocate for you. Her frustration. Nurses are the advocates for patients, and on one level, that's acknowledged, but they are only treated that way until they disagree with doctors, at which point they are often shut out of whatever process is occurring, in a way that you cannot shut out a family member. This creates what she describes as a frustrating situation where the stakeholders who will serve as patient advocates and educators are shut out of the processes like this one because they are the ones likely to, as Louise puts it, take a hammer to the nut inside the process, an act that gets at the kernel of truth but shatters shells into breed wisely and maybe a bit messily. As the conversation ends, Donna concludes, and I quote, I think it's about power, and it's very seldom that power is given. The last 2 episodes of Surfing the Nash Tsunami, episodes 19 and 20 in season 4, have looked at patient and advocate reactions to 2 major events happening in fatty liver space today. Together, they paint a fairly complete picture of the excitements and frustrations the advocate community faces today. As I said last week, progress is a long journey, so let's all keep pushing. And while you do so, listen, sit back, enjoy, learn, and when you're done, join the discussion in our LinkedIn discussion group.
Jörn Schattenberg.
It's a great overview and voicing of what you as somebody who is a patient who works with patient advocacy feels about these different processes that somehow coincide now temporarily, which is very interesting to me. I think from the ICER report, something that stuck with me is that you said you're being used to paint the window, right? So I think it's about the patients. ICER actually has, or its task, as far as I understand, is also to provide, fair access and future innovative. And I understand that you feel that was left behind.
Donna Cryer.
Yes, I know that ICER's role in the ecosystem is to send up a scary enough signal before a price is actually set so that industry folks will be, too scared to set a high price. And there may be sort of a function in that or some type of value in that in getting to a lower, more affordable price. But I don't think it's the right way to get to a useful end by having bad models, bad math, assumptions that were not just apples and oranges, but a whole fruit salad. It was a mess. They should be embarrassed. They demonstrated that they didn't know anything about the disease. By the time you got to just let's throw some hepatitis C era restrictions and see which ones stick to the wall, they should just be embarrassed by themselves, and they should have just closed their book and go sit in a corner somewhere. It was shabby and shabby, and they should be embarrassed. The fact that they're not just I mean, that speaks more about them, but they should be embarrassed.
Roger Green.
So, Donna, first of all, as a forecaster and somebody who has an MBA and industry experience and background in stats, I have some of the things that you're talking about, that evaluation lacking. And I have to tell you candidly, I looked at that one slide with the steatotic liver disease and 7 different branches and all that stuff. And commercially, that presented really unnecessary challenges to the marketing and education and distribution of the drugs and diagnostics when they came out. Okay. Right. Number one, there's an old line somewhere somebody said about some animal being another animal designed by committee.
A camel being an elephant designed by committee, I believe.
Yeah, there you go. Well, by that standard, this would be a llama, which would be an elephant designed by a committee that wanted something soft and fluffy at the end.
I understand. And here's the thing, to act like I don't understand. Tell this to somebody who doesn't know better is really, I should get that printed on a t-shirt. But I understand why we needed to do something because of shots across the bow, if you will, from your current home there in Australia. And those journals answered then in journals, and some physicians in some areas of the world starting preemptively without talking to everyone else, starting to use new terminology. And it was a noble aim by AASLD and EASL to want to come into this, provide a platform for unity. What was lacking was the proper application of their stature to just tell people to quit, that we need to focus on the job we have to do. And it is not helpful to our goal to have this convoluted name change and resources and time spent on this. They did not do that because, once again, those are not the skills they have. You would need to possess, though, the humility to realize that those are not the skills you have and to listen to others who have those skills. And that did not happen here. And so that's why I'm frankly pissed, because every entity in here involved has been told by people who have the requisite experience and knowledge what's the right thing to do if the goal is patient health. So I either have to surmise that is that others have a different goal, or they lack the self-awareness and humility to be able to listen and get out of the way.
So can I posit a third option?
Okay.
It's a little more benign than either of those two. Sociology looks a lot at in-group and out-group. This whole process was constructed for an in-group. And unfortunately, Jeff McIntyre, your guy, who I love and agree with on this, made the point that if 72% of the participants come from one stakeholder group and only 66% are needed to define a consensus, then if you get 90% of that stakeholder group on board, the rest of the world doesn't matter. So if the goal is to get to 66%, if 72% of the votes come from the in-group, and you have built a career on your ability to marshal and steward the in-group towards conclusions, then in fact what you will proceed to do is use the skills you have in pursuit of the goal you have the way you laid it out, which is great until you get to the rest of the world. So in that context, when you make a request to say, bring in all these out-groups with out-group experts that you guys don't know how to evaluate to provide what you're missing, you've completely changed the rules. And what that bespeaks, I think, is the fundamental conflict here, which is that everybody knows what they're going to get beat up for, and mostly people are trying not to get beat up. And as you point out, this isn't Alzheimer's, this isn't cancer. Patients don't have the kind of cudgel that they can use to beat people up effectively. Pardon the colorfulness of my verbs. Sometimes I can't help myself. And there we are. And by the way, just to understand, I'm about to turn to Louise, although it's now 2 a.m. in Australia and in Perth, and to say that when Louise talks about the way that allied health providers are treated in these processes, she's not much less emotional than you are. And Louise, I think you basically say the same things. Yeah.
I think every patient should bring a nurse with them, and we'll sneak you in the room and share our little seat with you. I think it'd only be fair.
Louise Campbell.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think just listening to you there and that impassioned statement isn't, and Roger, you're right, it is exactly where I come from. I obviously have had a recent relative in hospital, and I was mortified in one respect. The comment was that so-and-so, you are really lucky to have this person advocate for you. A nurse is a patient advocate. We should not be reminded that it is a privilege for a patient to have a family member be that advocate. When we talk about these processes, there are not enough nurses on those panels because our job is different. I have been met throughout my career with some great physicians, and I have worked with some great physicians until you see the opposite side to their belief. And then you're just a nurse, because you are advocating for the patient's well-being, which differs sometimes from the research agenda or the agenda that is coming there. But that is my role. That is what my profession is about. It is to sit there and listen to both sides, but to be coming down on the side of the patient's well-being, their thoughts, their feelings, the way they want things to be portrayed. Because sometimes they don't have a voice in hospital. They don't have a relative. And that is a tragic place to be, but we have to keep our professional integrity. And which is why I do talk passionately about we are not seen enough on these panels. We are not in the process enough in the care pathways, yet we are going to be the educators. And I've been an advocate for having that discussion a few years back with Stephen about opening the nut. You've got to take a hammer to that nut. But then when we get to the end of getting to that nut, it is going to become messy. It's going to become fractioned. That shell goes everywhere. It's how we pick up those pieces and move forward, bring them back together again, and where do we move positively through? Because I think moving on from this, we will have a potential definition that we can't even educate people on currently, let alone another 7 different branches. But we are ultimately trying to find people's sick livers and then get to the right diagnosis to help that cause. But could it derail just even looking, which is my fear? Do we detract from making people aware of liver disease and fatty liver per se as the biggest global health problem and fracture it so much that we can't bring people together? And I certainly would find difficulty trying to educate. I've got GPs who still tell patients it's just fat in the liver, don't worry about it, it's not related to your cholesterol, it's not related to anything else, and just ignore it. So I think I do obviously align a lot with Donna, but that's because my profession aligns, and it is supposed to align to be that other voice in the room. But when we're not in the room, we can't do that.
I think it's really about power. It's great that it's coming up to Mother's Day for me to realize that my mother was right about several things. This is one of them. And this is about power. And who defines the field? Power is seldom given. You usually have to take it.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the reviews section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. Next week, EASL Vice Secretary Alexander Krag and Education Counselor Sven Franke will be joining us to begin our preview of the 2023 EASL Congress. Should be fascinating, should be fun. So until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.